Support Pro Play Games on Patreon.
Hey guys, it's your boy Yeehaw, Yadam here on the PPG channel doing another deck profile for the long-awaited Charlotte Katakuri. Now, before I even start with the deck profile, may I just say, if you've had the opportunity to see this card in person, it is just an absolute masterpiece. I was not originally excited about the white background for the leaders, but let me tell you, Bandai, you knocked it out of the park. You made me a believer. So, let's get started with the deck profile. So, with Charlotte Katakuri being introduced into the game, you get the Big Mom Pirate. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about where he kind of fits into the metagame after the deck profile. So if you guys want to go ahead and see that, just stick around towards the end. So initially, starting the deck profile, we will have Charlotte Pudding. Now, Charlotte Pudding is the Nami of the deck. It is a 1/2 1k counter that goes ahead and looks at the top 4 cards from your deck and adds you a Big Mom Pirate and or Sanji character. Obviously, because she is a searcher, most of the time searchers have the stipulation you can't search itself. So, and Charlotte Pudding is not an exception to that rule. So Charlotte Pudding being unable to find another Charlotte Pudding, you know, it just is what it is. So the one thing I will note that is very interesting about this searcher is the fact that it doesn't look at the top 5, it looks at the top 4. So don't let your opponent ever, when they go ahead and play the Charlotte Pudding, look at more than 4, right? It is not a Curly D, it is not a Nami, it is not a Buggy. It looks for 4. What she searches is basically the entirety of the deck except for one card, and that card is right here, Shirahoshi. So Shirahoshi is one of the more impactful triggers that this deck has, and it goes ahead and lets you draw the top 3 cards and then remove or trash 2 cards from your hand. It is a filter, it is a cycle, and an all-around very really solid trigger. If it triggers early, that's great. If it triggers late, that's great, as long as it's not too late, right? As long as we're not losing the turn that it triggers, it is a fine trigger to just have at that specific time. So I wanted to go ahead and show her first because that's kind of what yellow really introduces to the game. It introduces this very heavy trigger mechanic for characters, right? So we've already seen Boa Hancock being able to have this a very similar trigger like ability, and a couple other cards in the game have already had this, but yellow really takes that and takes it in leaps. So speaking of triggers, let's go ahead and talk about one of the best character late game triggers, and that is going to be a structure deck yellow card, Charlotte Brûlée. Now Brûlée, why is it a better late game character? Is because it is a blocker. It is a Boa Hancock for the yellow deck, and the fact that Katakuri can make sure that you look at your life, you go a little peek. If that peak doesn't show, shows an important card like Charlotte Brûlée, Shirahoshi, you really have a little bit of options there. With a card like Brûlée, most of the time you can bottom deck it, and then you already know towards the later portions of the game, when your opponent has to go for their all-ins or they're going to go ahead and try to finish off the game, they're going to have to deal with one bonus blocker they may have or may have not accounted for. And that's why I think this is a very solid late game option. Even if it's towards the mid game, if you have board presence, board control, you might want to even keep it towards the top, because if your opponent is swinging at your life or just ignoring your board, Brûlée comes down, keeps your board protected, and gives you an excess blocker. But that's not usually the case. Most of the time your opponent has to go ahead and deal with the board, because if you don't deal with the board for 1 to 2 turns, you're basically losing the game at that point, because all those cards are going to trigger interaction from your opponent when they turn sideways. So Brûlée is probably one of the better late game options the deck has, whereas these next few cards are ones that you want to trigger almost immediately. So speaking of the one that you want to trigger immediately, we have Pero Sparrow, which is an additional searcher, right? So one of the reasons they may have not given Pudding the search 5 is because they also gave the deck a Pero Sparrow. Pero Sparrow lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck and go ahead and add a Big Mom types character card. Now this card doesn't have the restriction of adding itself, so it can even add itself, which is really really powerful. It can go ahead and just, the fact that it is a 5k body that comes out of life for free is very very impactful. If this is the first 1 to 2 lives, your opponent's going to be put on a very serious or solid back foot. Along with that, we have another 5k body trigger, which is Smoothie, and obviously the one that we all know and love, Cracker. With all of these possible triggers, the probability of us hitting one of these between the first 3 lives is very very real. The fact that Charlotte Katakuri can swing for 1 Dawn, look, and then go ahead and make sure that it's there, or cycle, makes it so that the life isn't stagnant. And even if it didn't have it within the first 2 lives, the fact that he can go ahead and cycle his life makes it much more plausible that in those lives you can get a very powerful trigger like Pero, Smoothie, Cracker. And regardless of which one it is, it's going to be just very difficult to deal with. The fact that they're just a 5k body for free, yes, you do have to discard a card in hand, but that's not necessarily a neg1, because the amount of times that your opponent is going to have to discard a card to defend these interactions is going to be calculated in that. So you can't really decided that removing a card is too impactful. The only time that these cards you may not want to remove a card from your hand is towards the later portions of the game. If it's the last trigger, you might want to keep it in hand just for that 1k counter that most of them have. Sparrow doesn't have it, but Smoothie and Cracker do. So in those scenarios, you might want to not trigger them. But other than that, you most often want to summon these and go ahead and keep board control in your favor, because that's what Katakuri wants to do. It wants to use its very powerful leader abilities and 5k bodies to just go ahead and push the tempo as much as it can. And none of these cards are an exception to that rule. So then moving forward, so now that we've dealt with our mid game, right, we have putting to search our deck, we've got a nice little mid game. Really, what are we following it up with after that? Well, starting off, we've got the structure deck Big Mom. Now structure deck Big Mom is just a big body that has a very fantastic on play ability. Most of the times character costs that have an 8k stat line are in the cost range of 6 to be an 8k with 1k counter. I think of cards like Thatch. So usually you're a 6-8 with 1k. The fact that Mama's a 7-8 obviously is not a countered card, but has a very powerful on play ability is really darn nice. Not only that, but it also has a very solid thematic effect in the life or death. She literally comes down for 7 Dawn and says life or death. Do you want to remove some life or do you want to gain me a life? So it's very, very cool in that aspect. Most of the time your opponents will choose to give away a life. So in a sense, it goes summon for 7, remove a life, which is really, really powerful. If you do have tempo, you have the board in your favor, you should be in a really solid spot developing the 7-drop Mom. And then to combo off with the 7-drop Mom, we have Charlotte Katakuri. Now, Charlotte Katakuri is one of the weirder forms of removal, one of the new forms of removal that got added into the set. It is removal on a stick. It is an 8-8, so yes, you're paying 1 more for Katakuri, but at the cost of either gaining you a life or removing a very powerful character from your opponent's board. This is one of the reasons that Eustace Captain Kid kind of took a step back in this format. Not to say that Film Kid isn't going to be a very powerful deck, but the versions that we've known for set 1 and set 2 have had to adapt in order to deal with the Charlotte Katakuri. You can't really play these big bodies and hope that they don't get removed, because this card just kind of comes down and says get out of here, which is really, really nice. And if again you have the tempo in your favor, it can go ahead and put one of your very powerful triggers, specifically Shida Hoshi in best case scenario, right back into your life area, so you can go ahead and trigger it once again. So really, really solid, and just a solid effect in general. And if you couple that up with just how big he is, he's an 8k for 8, so you can keep up 2 Dawn, which lets you leave up for a very powerful defensive ability as well. So it's honestly an overall very powerful card. Lastly, to round off the deck, we've got 3 Charlotte Linlin, so 3 10-drops. Now the 10-drop is just, it is the 7-drop, but in an inevitable form, right? So the only thing I don't like about the 10-drop is the fact that, like every 10-drop, you have to completely tap out for it, which is scary, right? If you don't have any sort of Dawn up, your opponent doesn't have to calculate. He can just look at the cards in your hand. If he puts all the cards in your hand at a 2k cost, well, then he kind of knows exactly what he needs to attack for. Sometimes you are very forced to play this card because you just have no other play and no other way to survive. So sometimes she can go ahead and, heal a Brûlée. She can remove a card, and it's honestly very, very powerful for the Whitebeard matchup, because Whitebeard now has to play in a very different form than it had to in the past. It basically forces Whitebeard to just take all the hits, because there's no point in defending, because if you go ahead and 9-drop and it's like pass and it's like cool, 10-drop, remove a life. So it forces them to not be able to play the 9-drop, which is very interesting, and it's a different form of that the way it doesn't really want to function. So the fact that this card exists allows that to just be just a really interesting matchup in general. Not only that, it is very pivotal in the yellow mirror match. The fact that your opponent has to, whoever resolves more of these big lads is inevitably going to end up winning the game, because as long as, like, if I go to Linlin, you have to go Linlin, because if not, I can't remove your 12k body. It's just too darn big, and if I don't have a character that can go ahead and equalize that, then we're going to be in a tough spot. So very powerful card, warping as most 10-drops are. Think of Kaido, think of 9-drop Whitebeard. I know he's not a 10-drop, but think of him as a 10-drop. He's certainly up there. All these cards definitely warp the meta, and Charlotte Linlin is not one that is going to be escaping that boat as well. Lastly, we're going to go ahead and show you guys the counters that we use in this deck, as well as the option cards. So counter wise, I'm going to show you the one that you may be able to summon more often than not is going to be Sanji. Now Sanji is the fact that he is a 3k. The only thing that it does not have going for it is the fact that Marco is going to come down and say, Sanji, get removed off the board, which is not great, right? Because oftentimes if you're going second, if you just field this Sanji, you're forced to kind of swing with the Sanji almost immediately in the red matchup, because if not, you're susceptible to a Vista, a Marco, any form of removal can just kind of sneeze him off the board. So In those matchups, be very, very careful. In other matchups, he just says draw a card, which is really, really darn nice. You don't feel bad about that. Obviously, if you feel this into black, be careful because Shockwave can go ahead and hit you. But other than that, you're not in a bad spot. The fact that he can go ahead and swing for 5, which is an aggressive number, draw you a card, is always pretty darn nice. Strusen is another playable 1-drop because of the fact that Strusen, depending on the matchup, can remove just a body, such as like an Ezo, a Buggy, a thing of that, just a pesky thing. You are trashing a card, so he's not free in that sense, but you mostly want to field this card versus matchups that want to stick behind a 1k blocker, which is specifically Law, Crocodile, any deck of that nature, maybe even Doflamingo. If you see those decks, this card will come down, and then like, yes, they'll try to survive or sit behind a 1-drop blocker to, you know, chump block your big mama. But if you can go ahead and Strusen them and then swing in with the big bomb, you might get them where they weren't expecting. Lastly, we do play 4 of the Pudding 2K. The only reason I leave this one in its last position is because A, it's not as playable as the other 2, and B, it is not searchable by Pudding. Obviously, Pudding is a searcher, and most searchers do have that restriction, so Pudding can't add the 2K searcher, but Sparrow can, which is pretty darn nice. Lastly, we have a couple of events that I want to just go off and show you guys to round off the deck. These events are Thunderbolt, which again, in a deck that wants to keep board control, keep its presence, Thunderbolt is a really solid card because sometimes you can't deal with a character when it comes out. They're very impactful. They do their thing. You can go ahead and remove a life to keep that board presence and then keep pushing the tempo in your favor. And Thunderbolt does that very, very well. Not only that, but it's a fantastic trigger in life that Katakuri can go ahead and leave in the top, bottom. It's just very, very flexible with the Katakuri leader. And then we have lastly the Sovereignty. Now, Sovereignty has a really interesting trigger ability in life. This is one of probably the worst cards to put in the bottom of your life for your opponent, because if your opponent is trying to all in you and they're forced to all in you, they hit this card, they now have to deal with a bonus life, and if you have a Brûlé plus this, you just have a bunch of shenanigans, which is interesting, fun, enjoyable. It depends how you want to look at it, but sometimes being on the opponent's team and they go trigger 5 times in life, you're gonna have a very triggered time. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoy this deck profile. If you want to go ahead and see gameplay of this Charlotte Katakuri deck, go check us out on our Patreon, where we're going to be doing a lot of different OPO3 games versus Katakuri, Zoro, and other decks from the meta to see how this deck fares up with them. So if you guys like this sort of content, make sure to check us out there. And as always, guys, I'll see ya on the next One Piece video. Later.